It's a vacation for the president, and the video shows a golf club in hand. But the reality for President Obama, he may have to work rather hard to rally support around the nuclear deal with Iran. He still says the U.S. could eventually have, in his words, a constructive relationship with that regime. The president also saying in an interview that aired today, those opposing the plan have yet to come up with a better alternative that prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Watch.
The question has to be, is there in fact a better path to preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon than this one? And I've repeatedly asked both Prime Minister Netanyahu and others to present me a reasonable, realistic plan that would achieve exactly what this deal achieves, and I have yet to get a response.
Our Kevin Corke is traveling with the president on the Vineyard, and Kevin giving the upcoming fight on Capitol Hill. I'm a little curious. He already said it twice, then he tripled down today, comparing people, Americans, who don't agree with him on this deal with hardliners in Iran. Some would go as far as saying comparing them to terrorists.
I have to tell you, that's a terrific question, but there's an old saying in politics, right? You say, don't pick a fight unless you know you can win the fight. And so politically speaking, understand this, the rhetoric actually probably helps the White House because it tends to galvanize Democratic support. And that's really what they're after, right? Galvanizing support on their side of the aisle to prevent a GOP veto override later on down the line. But the criticism, frankly, Harris, hasn't just been limited to Capitol Hill. It's coming out of Iran, too. In fact, the Supreme leader there among the most vocal critics. But the president is saying tonight that that shouldn't surprise anyone.
I'm not interested in a Twitter back and forth with the Supreme leader. What I'm interested in is the deal itself, and can we enforce it. Keep in mind, Fareed, when we got the interim deal, as you're aware, the way this thing evolved, there's always a gap between rhetoric and action. You know, the Supreme Leader is a politician, apparently, just like everybody else.
Well, a very interesting take, right? But keep this in mind as well. In diplomacy, there are no friends and there really are no enemies, right? It's just interests, and you're looking for common interests. So sometimes, Harris, the word that you give to your internal audience, especially politically, is vastly different from what you might be saying in an exchange privately.
Gosh, the only word that comes to mind is disingenuous, but we'll move on. So you mentioned rhetoric as being part of the strategy. Do they have, though, an actual strategy to override a veto if the president has to face more opposition among his own party than maybe he's prepared for?
Yeah, terrific again. But remember this about Washington. It's all about whipping the votes. So that means among your friends, you just remind them gently what we've done for you in the past. How can we help you advance your agenda in the future? And it's also an opportunity for the White House to engage some political adversaries and see if maybe there might be some common ground. But ultimately, it means that some people will have to vote for a deal that they don't fully support. Or in the case of Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill, it means taking a much closer look at the deal.
It's not a perfect deal, obviously. We don't trust Iran. But I think too many people are judging this deal against the status quo, not what the new situation would be on the world stage.
Meanwhile, the president, of course, spending a little time with family and friends, fellowshipping, but in between there'll be a few phone calls. We're also told he may enlist the support of his vice president and even his Secretary of State to get out there to help him sell the deal. Now, I should also add very quickly, Harris, despite a number of high-profile defections, including Chuck Schumer of New York, the White House remains confident they still have the numbers to withstand a potential GOP veto override. But still a little time between now and the vote in September. We'll see how that all pans out. A lot of time for lawmakers to give it a very close look.
Well, it's 159 pages. You can find the PDF online, so it's not that hard to take a close look for any of us. And one last point, people might be reading that and talking with those lawmakers. So that also is going to be happening between now and September. We'll be watching. Kevin,
Perfectly
thank you.
Said.
Well, the president's critics on Capitol Hill are not the only Americans raising their voices over the nuclear deal with Iran. A group of victims of terror attacks has now filed a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit, to stop the government from releasing assets that would put billions of dollars into Iran's hands. Rick Leventhal is working that part of the story.
Stuart Hirsch, a Navy veteran from New York, moved to Israel 25 years ago. He was sipping coffee at a pedestrian mall in Jerusalem in September of 1997 when 3 Hamas suicide bombers blew themselves up. Hirsch suffered mild brain damage, burns, and back injuries. 200 others were hurt, and 5 Israelis killed.
These people were trained by the Republican Guard. So naturally, that would be Iran. And we expected, according to the law, that they would have to compensate us.
A U.S. law passed in 1992 allows victims of state-sponsored terror to sue the governments financing the attacks. In 2003, Hirsch and other victims went to federal court and won a judgment against Iran of more than $400 million. But the Iranians ignored the order and several others, totaling close to $2 billion. Meanwhile, Tehran has up to $150 billion frozen in overseas banks that's supposed to be released when the nuclear deal is approved and economic sanctions are lifted. Hirsch and 24 other plaintiffs say Iran's frozen funds are their last chance at justice. So they filed suit against the State Department, Treasury Department, and Secretary of State John Kerry, demanding Iran's frozen assets not be released until they get the money they're owed.
These are the victims of terrorism. These are America's victims, and America should remember them even as they're remembering Iran.
Attorneys say pursuing the judgments wasn't easy for the victims, who had to relive the horrors of the attacks in court. Giving the Iranians their frozen funds without compensating the people harmed by the regime is a cruel twist, they say, adding insult to injury.
This is not an issue of politics. It is an issue simply of human rights.
A State Department spokesman says there's no connection between sanctions relief and any outstanding court judgments, and the U.S. holds no control over Iran's money, calling this legal matter a separate issue. In New York, Rick Leventhal, Fox News.
It has been 1 year since teenager Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. As you know, it touched off a violent reaction among some people there rioting. We all watched it as a nation. With that in the past, a look 1 year later. And remembering a legend, we've been talking about him this hour, sportscaster and Pro Football Hall of Famer Frank Gifford has died.